As the global community watches with bated breath, the Kremlin has once again made its stance unequivocally clear regarding the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. On the eve of a much-anticipated summit in Alaska between United States President Donald Trump and the Russian head of state, Moscow has signaled no deviation from its long-held demands. A spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Alexei Fadiv, reiterated that the foundational requirements for peace remain unchanged from those articulated over a year ago. These conditions, which Moscow deems non-negotiable, form the bedrock of its strategic objectives and reflects a consistent policy position that has weathered both battlefield developments and international diplomatic pressure. The core demands include the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian military forces from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, regions Russia now considers parts of its federation. Furthermore, Moscow insists that Kyiv must formally renounce any aspiration to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, enshrining neutrality as a permanent fixture of its national security policy. The lifting of all Western sanctions imposed on Russia since the conflict's escalation is another critical prerequisite for any potential settlement. This resolute posture from Moscow comes at a pivotal moment, with the new Trump administration in Washington actively seeking to broker a peace deal. President Trump has publicly stated his goal of ending the war, suggesting that a realistic outcome might involve territorial exchange between the two sides. However, the Kremlin's public pronouncement appears to preemptively reject any framework that does not fully endorse its territorial claims. This diplomatic positioning underscores the significant gap that exists between the warring parties and their international backers. From Moscow's perspective, the current firm lines and the realities on the ground must be the starting point for any serious negotiation. His perspective fundamentally clashes with Ukraine's position and that of its allies, who maintain that any alteration of Ukraine's 1991 borders through military force is a violation of international law. The Kremlin's insistence on these terms is seen by many analysts as a maximalist stance, effectively demanding Kyiv's capitulation on key issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Observers noted that these conditions would require Ukraine not only to cede the nearly 19% of its territory currently under Russian control, but also to withdraw its force from areas within those annexed regions that it still defends. Within the Trump administration, the reaction to Moscow's firm stance has been carefully managed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, while expressing hope for the success of the upcoming talks in Alaska, acknowledged the complex realities of the conflict. Speaking to reporters, Secretary Rubio emphasized that any lasting peace would necessitate conversations about both security guarantees for Ukraine and the resolution of territorial dispute. This sentiment indicates a recognition within Washington that a simple return to the pre-conflict status quo is unlikely. The Secretary of State's comments suggest a pragmatic approach, one that seeks to find a workable solution even in the face of Moscow's unyielding public declarations. The challenges for President Trump and his diplomatic team, led by Rubio, will be to navigate the vast chasm between Russia's demand and Ukraine's non-negotiable principle. The administration has clarified that it will not pursue agreement with Russia without Ukraine's direct involvement and an immediate ceasefire. President Trump himself has reportedly assured European leaders and the Ukrainian president in a virtual summit that he would not negotiate territorial issues on their behalf, but would press for an immediate cessation of hostilities as a first step. The international context surrounding these diplomatic maneuvers is fraught with tension, high stakes. European allies, particularly the co-chair of the coalition of the willing France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, have articulated their own clear principles for peaceful resolution. In a joint statement, these nations emphasize that meaningful negotiations can only occur after a ceasefire, that international borders must not be changed by force, and that Ukraine must receive robust and credible security guarantees for its sovereignty. This position aligns closely with Ukraine's own state's demands, which include a stable ceasefire before any territorial discussions, compensation for damage, the return of all prisoners and abducted children, and the maintenance of sanctions against Russia until it complies with the term of a peaceful agreement. The unity among European powers and their alignment with Kyiv presents a significant diplomatic counterweight to Moscow's demand. It signals to both Moscow and Washington that any deal brokered without their consent, or one that sacrifices Ukraine's fundamental sovereign right, is unlikely to be accepted or sustainable in the long term. This European solidarity also serves as a crucial backstop for Ukraine, ensuring that it is not isolated in any potential high-pressure negotiations. The Russian government's insistence on its term is deeply rooted in its long-standing grievance concerning NATO expansion and what it perceives as a threat to its security architecture. For decades, Russian leaders have viewed the eastward expansion of the Western military alliance as a direct challenge to their sphere of influence and a violation of alleged post-Cold War understanding. This perspective, often dismissed in the West, is a central tenet of Russian foreign policy and heavily influenced its action in Ukraine. The demand for Ukraine's neutrality is not merely a tactical objective in the current conflict. It represents a strategic imperative for Moscow to create a buffer zone and halt what it sees as the encroachment of a hostile military bloc on its border. The Kremlin frames its military operation not as a war of aggression, but as a defensive measure necessary to protect its national security interests and the right of Russian speakers in Ukraine. This narrative, consistently propagated through state media, underpins the domestic justification for the war and reinforces the government's uncompromising negotiating position. Understanding this deep-seated security anxiety is crucial for interpreting Moscow's current diplomatic intransigence. The economic dimensions of Russia's demand, specifically the call for the lifting of all Western sanctions, is also a critical component of its strategy. The extensive sanction regime, while not crippling the Russian war economy, has imposed significant costs and restricted access to key technologies and financial markets. The Kremlin views these sanctions as a form of economic warfare and their removal as a necessary condition for normalizing relations and achieving a comprehensive peace settlement. These demands, however, face strong opposition from the United States and its allies, who see sanctions as a vital tool for pressuring Moscow to end its aggression and as leverage in any negotiations. For Washington, the premature lifting of sanctions without significant concessions from Russia would be seen as a reward for its military action. This fundamental disagreement over the role and future of sanctions presents another major obstacle to a negotiated settlement. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent's office has been quietly analyzing the potential impacts of various sanctions relief scenarios, preparing for the complex economic negotiations that would inevitably follow any political breakthrough. The intricate web of financial restriction is tied to specific actions, and unraveling it would be a painstaking process contingent on verifiable steps from Moscow on the ground. The military situation on the front line provides a stark backdrop to these diplomatic exchanges. Russian forces continue to exert pressure in several key sectors, making incremental but steady gains, particularly in the Donetsk region. This military momentum is likely a key factor in the Kremlin's confidence and its unwillingness to soften its negotiating stance. Russian military strategists believe that time is on their side, and that sustained military pressure will eventually exhaust Ukraine's defense and weaken the resolve of its Western partner. The Kremlin appears to be operating under the assumption that battlefield success will translate directly into diplomatic leverage, forcing Kyiv and its allies to accept its term. This strategy of escalate to de-escalate or achieving political goals through military means has been a hallmark of Russian doctrine. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth and the Pentagon are closely monitoring these battlefield dynamics, providing President Trump with regular assessment of the military balance. The intelligence indicates that while Ukrainian forces are resilient, the relentless Russian assaults are taking a toll, highlighting the urgency of the diplomatic track. The Department of Defense continues to coordinate military support for Ukraine, ensuring its forces have the means to defend their position while the high-stakes negotiations unfold. Domestically, the Russian government's firm stance is also a matter of political necessity. The narrative of defending Russia's security interests and protecting Russian speakers has been central to maintaining public support for the prolonged and costly military campaign. Any perceived retreat from these core objectives could be viewed as a sign of weakness and potentially undermine domestic stability. The Kremlin's messaging consistently portrays Russia as a great power standing up to Western hegemony, and its demand for a new European security order are a reflection of these self-perceptions. This nationalist framing leaves little room for compromise on issues deemed vital to Russia's status and security. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard's agency has provided the White House with detailed analysis of Russian public opinion and elite political dynamics, noting the constraints these factors place on the Russian leadership. The report suggests that the Kremlin's hardline position is not merely a negotiating tactic, but also a reflection of a deeply ingrained worldview and a calculated political strategy to consolidate power at home. As President Trump prepared for the meeting in Alaska, he faces a diplomatic landscape fraught with challenges. On one hand, there is the Russian leadership, which appears confident in its military position and unyielding in its political demand. On the other hand, there is the Ukrainian government, backed by a united European front, which is determined not to sacrifice its sovereignty or territory for peace that it believes would be temporary and unjust. The Trump administration's strategy appears to be focused on achieving an immediate ceasefire as a first crucial step. The belief is that a pause in the fighting could create the necessary space for more substantive negotiations to begin, potentially de-escalating the conflict and allowing for a more deliberate diplomatic process. The White House has been careful to manage expectations, with spokespeople describing the Alaska summit as a listening exercise and an opportunity to understand the possibilities for a deal. This cautious approach reflects the immense difficulty of the task at hand. The success of this strategy will depend on President Trump's ability to persuade the Russian leader that a negotiated settlement is more beneficial than continued conflict, while also reassuring Ukraine and its allies that their core interests will not be compromised. The role of other key figures in the Trump administration will be crucial in the days and weeks following the Alaska summit. Attorney General Pam Bondi's Department of Justice may be called upon to address the complex legal issues surrounding sanctions and the potential prosecution of war crimes, a key demand from Kyiv. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem will be focused on the broader security implication for the United States, including the first risk of cyber warfare and disinformation campaign that often accompanies such high-stakes international negotiations. The entire national security apparatus, from the Central Intelligence Agency under Director John Ratcliffe to the various departments of the cabinet, will be engaged in supporting the president's diplomatic efforts. The challenge is not only to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine, but also to ensure that any agreement is enforceable, sustainable, and contributes to a more stable global security environment. The Kremlin's unwavering position, reiterated just before the Alaska summit, serve as a stark reminder of the profound disagreement that have fueled this devastating conflict. Moscow's demand for territorial recognition, Ukrainian neutrality, and the lifting of sanctions are not new, but their reassertions at this critical juncture sends a clear message that Russia does not intend to negotiate from a position of perceived weakness. The Russian government believes its military actions have created a new reality that the world must accept. This viewpoint is fundamentally at odds with the principles of international law and the position of Ukraine and the vast majority of the international community. The path to peace, therefore, remains incredibly narrow and fraught with obstacles. The upcoming meeting between President Trump and his Russian counterpart will be a critical test of whether diplomacy can bridge this divide or if the conflict is destined to continue on its tragic course. The world will be watching to see if a breakthrough is possible or if Moscow's firm stance on its term for the war end will prove to be an insurmountable barrier to peace. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. And that is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first ones on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you're a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build this show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.